Hello again. My name is Alex Katz. I'm the chair of the Council of Christians and Jews here in Victoria. Welcome to this event, which will be discussing this book, The Powerbroker, and we'll get to that in a minute. Let me begin by saying that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm going to take this opportunity to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land, their elders past, present, and emerging. And as anyone who knows me will know that that's not a token thing that I do. To me, that's a particularly important thing, especially whenever I hear acknowledgement of elders. I always think of my personal elders, my grandparents and my family who came to this country to make a better life for themselves. And I always think about the wonders that we have in this country. And so to me, the acknowledgement is always very personal. When we agreed to do this event on this date, the 1st of November, we discovered that today is actually All Saints Day. And for those who may not know what that is, I'm going to invite Colleen O'Reilly, Reverend Dr. Colleen O'Reilly, who's an Anglican priest and the chaplain of Trinity College, to tell us a little bit about what All Saints Day and why particularly the 1st of November is important in the Christian calendar. So over to you, Colleen.
Halloween, the evening before the Christian festival of All Saints, also known as All Hallows, hence the name Halloween. And of course, these days, Halloween has become a commercial opportunity and an event in the secular calendar. It's rather disconnected from its origins. But the origins of Halloween are indeed in the feast that the church kept today, All Saints' Day. It began first as a celebration for those who died as martyrs for their faith, but it's now kept as a remembrance of all those known and unknown whose lives have been exceptional in following the commandment to love God and to love others beyond even loving one's own life. The day originated in the churches of the East, the Orthodox churches, but very quickly became part of the calendar of the Western churches. And today, this feast day has been kept around, or will be kept around the world by mostly the more traditional churches, but most Christians will be giving thanks today for the company of all saints in whose presence we live. Tomorrow is All Souls. It's a time to remember all the departed and to give thanks for them, praying that God will hold all of those of God's making in God's hands and bring our own lives to fulfillment beyond this familiar world. In the Northern Hemisphere, of course, this is a time when the light is fading, winter is approaching, the nights are lengthening, so that sense of the light of God's presence shining shines into a growing darkness. But here in this Southland, as we can see today with the beautiful day that we've been given, it's the approach of summer. The light of this festival reminds us that even the sun's rays fade in comparison to the light of God's commandments that are shed upon our broken and divided world. And we are called to live the words of the prophet Micah, that to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. So let me just conclude with words from one of the contemporary prayers for today from the Church of England. God, lover of humankind, from all nations, peoples, and languages, you gather your saints into one communion of earth and heaven. Inspire your people in this present age to seek peace and hunger for justice, to practice mercy and purity of heart. And who does not want to say amen to that?
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Colleen. And I don't know about you, but I certainly didn't realize that Halloween had a religious element to it until I heard about All Saints Day and the way Colleen described that. So thank you for enlightening us. I think part of the purpose of the Council of Christians and Jews is to learn more about things like that, things that maybe we don't know, and things that certainly we see around us, but didn't know what they were. So thank you, Colleen, for enlightening us and for giving us that fascinating explanation. So now let's turn to our event for today. Let me give you some background. So this book that you may have seen, The Powerbroker by Michael Gawenda, was published a few months ago. And I first heard about it I actually heard that it was coming, but then I first heard about it when Philip Bliss, who's on the Council of Christians and Jews executive, told us that there's a chapter in the book about the Council of Christians and Jews, which was a little surprising when it says that the book is about Mark Leibler and about the Australian Jewish community. I don't think any of us expected that there'd be a chapter in the book about the Council of Christians and Jews. So we contacted Mark to see if he would be willing to be part of this event. I emailed him, not expecting that he personally would respond to me, not expecting maybe that he would respond to me at all. So I was particularly surprised that 2 days later, he called me personally to say that not only would he be interested, but that he'd be willing to be interviewed by Philip Bliss, who was president of the Jewish Community Council when Mark Leibler was president of the Zionist Federation. And in one of the big mantras in the book is about Mark always returning calls immediately to clients. I didn't know that that extended to non-clients as well, but we're very grateful that it did. And so this conversation will be about that chapter that you see is highlighted in my book, but also about other chapters also related to the causes that the CCJ pursues, including the Indigenous connection to the land. But I'll leave all that to Philip. So let me introduce Philip, who, as I said, is a former president of the Council of Christians and Jews, and was also president of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria in the 1990s, when Mark Leibler was president of the Zionist Federation of Australia. So over to you, Philip, to formally introduce Mark and to begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Alex. I've just actually one little correction. I think that I was actually president of the federal body of the Union for Progressive Judaism when Mark was ZFA president, but there may have been a little crossover, but it was all relevant. First of all, Mark, thank you for agreeing to participate this afternoon. And I'm sure many of you on this Zoom call are aware of Mark, but I'd like to just make sure that you know some of Mark's background. So let me just tell you, Mark Leibler, AC, is senior partner at Arnold Bloch Leibler and head of the firm's renowned taxation practice. For more than 40 years, Mark has acted for many of Australia's largest businesses and corporate leaders. He's recognised as one of the country's leading tax experts. Michael Gawenda's recently released biography of Mark, The Powerbroker, describes how Mark's leadership in the law has interconnected with his leadership of the Australian Jewish community, where he has headed both local and international Jewish bodies. He's national chairman of the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, life chairman of the United Israel Appeal of Australia, and governor of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce. He's also on the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel and a governor of Tel Aviv University. Mark's determination to use the law as an instrument of social justice is demonstrated by his profound contribution to Indigenous rights and reconciliation. He served as co-chair of Reconciliation Australia, and more recently co-chaired both the expert panel and the Referendum Council on constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Mark, let's start with chapter 13 of the book, where my gold is actually running out, but I don't know if anybody else has had that as an issue, but that's aside. You're taking your daughter to one of those inter-school debate evenings. This particular evening in the middle of winter in 1991, you're sitting down at one of the classrooms at Brighton Grammar School, and there on the blackboard is something to really turn your stomach. Can you give us a little bit of background as to what's on the blackboard and where things develop?
Well, got to remember this is almost 30 years ago, and my daughter was 15 years old, participating in an inter-school debate, and it was held at Brighton Grammar. I mean, today she has children that are older than she was
Right.
at the time. So it goes back and you know, since I agreed to have this discussion, so since we're talking about a long time ago, I did go back and I had a look at the what occurred at the time and the correspondence, all of the correspondence between myself and Archbishop Rayner and the headmaster at Brighton Grammar. They were published in a magazine called Generation magazine, together with articles from by prominent personalities from the Council of Christians and Jews. So you can imagine that I arrive at this place where in the room the debate is starting, and suddenly my attention is sort of drawn to the blackboard, and you know, I'm just sort of staring at it. And let me read to you, this was what appeared on the blackboard. The first Christian martyr, Stephen the deacon. In his defence, Stephen made it clear that he believed that the new law of Jesus was about to take the place of the old law of Moses. He told the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, that they had rejected and killed God's promised Messiah, Jesus, who had been raised from death. This angered the Jewish authorities so much that they killed Stephen in an act of mob violence. This is what I see on the board, and I think to myself, my God, what? This is what they're teaching young children, and then they wonder about, you know, anti-Semitism. So I must say I was pretty worked up about the whole thing, and I think it was the next day I sent off a letter to the headmaster of Brighton Grammar expressing my dissatisfaction and explaining how this sort of teaching to school children was clearly calculated to lead to, you know, anti-Semitism. And the answer I got back actually, well, sent me into some sort of a tailspin, because in effect the answer was, well, too bad, so what? This is Christian scriptures, and if you come to an Anglican school, that's what you should expect to find. So then I sent off a missive to the Archbishop, and well, that's where all of this has started. And look, the answer I got back from the Archbishop to my complaint was not very satisfactory, because what he in essence said was, yes, what I'd seen on the blackboard could lead to anti-Semitism, but there was no evidence that had been taught in such a way that it would lead to anti-Semitism. Well, then of course I responded further, and I must say I was pretty riled up. If you look at the book, you'll see that. Well, I'm coming to that. But if you look at the book, Michael Gawenda's book. Sorry. Yeah, yes. No, that's what I'm talking about.
Oh, the other book, right?
No. If you look at the book, the Powerbroker, I mean, Michael Gawenda does suggest that, you know, I can be very difficult and arrogant from time to time. I'm not sure that there might be a bit of an exaggeration there. I don't necessarily agree with everything that Michael's written in his book, but I've got to say that when I went back and reread very recently this correspondence, even I was a bit taken aback by, you know, the extent of my emotional upset, I think is the best way to put it, at what I'd seen. And so let me give you just a bit of a flavour for what went on. So in my letter, my further response to the Archbishop, let me just give you, it's a fairly long letter. And by the way, I must say, I'm not an expert on Christian-Jewish relations, and I didn't know very much about the detail, but I had, the privilege of input from two very distinguished rabbis, Rabbi John Levi and also the late Rabbi Lubovsky. And they helped me considerably. And by the way, I made quite an effort. I read a lot of material, and suddenly overnight, I wouldn't say overnight, but over a few days, I did develop some understanding and expertise of what went on beforehand. And of course, the real problem in what appeared on the blackboard there is the allegation that Jews killed Christ. And we all know how many Jews had died as a result of that being promulgated over a couple of thousand of years. And also that when Christianity came, it superseded and invalidated Judaism. So that was a problem. Now, just to give those who are watching some sense of flavour of what I wrote to the Archbishop, here's just a few sentences. For example, hatred justified in the name of God is more odious than hatred which is not protected by the sanctity of God's word. Again, I only ask that after 1900 years, you call a halt to allowing the New Testament to be used as a gospel of hate against Jews. Again, why include within the selection to teach to the children particular texts which, if not carefully explained and placed in a proper context, could give rise to prejudice and anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
And again, the stark telling of the story in the form in which it appeared on the blackboard without appropriate explanation or commentary will clearly be calculated to give rise to anti-Semitism and prejudice against the Jewish people. And then, am I to take it that the Australian Anglican Church is a cultural and moral backwater, teaching orthodox views that have been repudiated worldwide for 2 decades? I refer back to Vatican II and so on and so forth. So, I mean, the answer I got from the Archbishop was not a very pleasant answer. But he said, look, I really don't want to respond to you because you're a very arrogant man. I mean, that's fundamentally what he said. And it then took, almost 5 years. The Council of Christians and Jews worked on this as a result of this incident, which had been drawn to their attention. And then in 1995, I think late 1995, you held up earlier the product, rightfully explaining the word of truth. And I think that there are some 20,000 of these, which were printed. They were widely distributed. It was
they were sent to every school, every non-state school in Australia.
Yeah.
Fantastic, and a fantastic redo then afterwards of rereading Paul, which was which came out from that, which was also sent to all the schools around Australia. And considering that at that time in 91, in fact, I was at the meeting when you raised it at the JCCV, I think. I remember that very clearly, and but I certainly wasn't president of the JCCV. But it was one of those things that's always stuck in my mind, particularly when I got involved with the CCJ. But it just so happened that the CCJ had only started in 1985. So it was a very young organisation, but the early leaders within the CCJ were very brilliant people. I mean, you had Professor Anderson and a lot of people that were very involved on the academic side of theology, and they were able to put this book together, have it published and sent out pretty fast, and you launched it, didn't you?
Yes. No, I don't think I launched it. I was at the launch.
Oh, right.
And reference was made, but
Powerbroker.
I don't think I actually launched it. But, you know, we're going back a long time.
Yes, I know. We were children then, Things have changed, and maybe it needed the arrogance and the pushing to get this change to be active. But I think that it was a milestone in Christian-Jewish relations that has stayed with us to today. And I think we're at a meeting that we were just talking about, maybe updating both those books, because it never leaves us in the area of anti-Semitism. So that was basically one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this to the CCJ. But what I would like to do is, and I'm sure at the end there'll be a number of questions, but if we could move on today on the question of anti-Semitism and your involvement with the Aboriginal community, reconciliation, and where that brings us in 2020 in actually raising the major question on how we recognise the Aboriginal community.
So,
just a simple little.
Yeah. Let me. I probably the best starting point is William Cooper.
Yeah.
William Cooper was a Yorta Aboriginal leader. He it was amazing. What he did was really quite amazing, because shortly, within I think a couple of weeks after Kristallnacht, back in 1938, you know, the time when the Nazis harassed and launched attacks against Jewish property, and the precursor of what was, you know, shortly to take place thereafter. He actually, this was a man who at the time was, you know, 77 years old. He lived in Footscray. He led a march of some 10 kilometres with his Aboriginal colleagues to the German consulate and wanted to present a petition calling on the Germans to halt the persecution of the Jews. Now, you know, obviously that the German consulate refused to, not surprisingly, accept the petition, but it was an amazing and sort of unique act at the time. So, I mean, in terms of Aboriginal Jewish relations, the person who had the greatest impact on me was unquestionably Noel Pearson. And I imagine Noel Pearson is well known to everyone on this webinar. I mean, anyone who reads the newspapers, who follows what goes on, he's a remarkable man with an incredible intellect. He was actually articled to me in my legal practice back in the early 1990s. He and I argue with each other about who learned more from whom. He reckons he learned more from me, and I think I learned more from him. But he was a keen observer of the Jewish people. But the one thing in particular that Noel Pearson noted about the Jewish people was that on the one hand, we maintained and kept our unique traditions, but on the other hand, we became an integral part of Australian society and were able to play a significant role there. And he contrasted that integration with assimilation.
Mm.
And when he looked at what we as the Jewish community, the Jewish people had achieved in this country and elsewhere in other Western countries as well, this is what he was looking towards in terms of what the Aboriginal community might be able to achieve here in Australia. On the one hand, they wanted to play meaningful roles and to enjoy everything that Australia had to offer and to play their full roles in society at large. But on the other hand, they wanted to be able to maintain their tradition. So this is what he took away from the Jewish people. And also the other important takeaway was the truth-telling, both the good and the bad, the importance of never forgetting our history.
Mm.
So, yeah.
So, yeah, I was actually privileged to be with Abe Schwartz, and my wife was there in Berlin when a copy of that letter
That's right.
was presented by William Cooper to the German ambassador for Jewish affairs. A very emotional evening, very emotional.
Mm.
But nowadays, and especially emanating from America, we see a lot of issues around Black Lives Matter, and a number of people, especially more on the right wing of our community, and certainly in America, there's an attempt to dilute the issues of problems for the Black communities in America and here. Have you come across much in the way of anti-Semitism in your workings and dealings with the Aboriginal community here?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, if you look, obviously, I can't know, there are some 400,000, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia, and you can't know all of them. And, amongst all people, there's going to be the share of anti-Semites. But in terms of the leadership and the ethos of all of the prominent Aboriginal leaders that I've come across, there's never been an issue. Never. Quite to the contrary. But Black Lives Matter is another story. I mean, there is a lot of racism directed at African Americans. There's no question about it. And there's also no doubt that the authorities in various places and at various times have done the wrong things. And, this is something that needs to be dealt with. But there have, in terms of, weeding out bad policemen, I think, is very important. But dismantling police forces leads to anarchy and not civilization. So you have to find the happy medium. And the other thing is, there's no doubt in relation to the actual organisation, Black Lives Matter in the United States, that there are anti-Semitic elements in the leadership there. I mean, elements that have been promoting the BDS, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, and and criticisms of Israel which go well beyond anti-Zionism and morph into anti-Semitism. So, you know, you just have to be careful.
Yep, absolutely. So, actually, before we get on to the next bit, how much influence did Ron Caston have on you in terms of becoming involved in Aboriginal reconciliation?
Well, yeah, a big influence. I mean, he brought the Orta case to us, to our firm, but, you know, frankly, the biggest influence he had was, you know, persuading Noel Pearson to come to our firm. I mean, it's very difficult for me to convey how remarkable that man is, the extent of his intellect. I mean, he is a towering figure.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you do become involved, probably as much as anybody possibly could, with Aboriginal reconciliation, and which sort of culminates in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. There's a lot of excitement, and then it gets summarily dismissed by Malcolm Turnbull and later by Morrison. That must have been a real gut kicker, but where do you see reconciliation going from here? I mean, are we just treading water? Is the situation beyond repair, or do we just wait for a change of leadership?
No, it's not beyond repair at all, in my view. I must say that I was very upset with Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, he of all people would know and understand that to call what was being proposed the third chamber of the parliament is absolutely ridiculous. Mm. So, and not only that, I mean, he came out, after all, Pat Anderson and I were co-chairs of the Referendum Council, which had been appointed by him to deal with this, and he comes out with his press statement without a phone call. He finally made that phone call, you know, 3 months later, but and we did have some words at the time, but you know, maybe it had something to do with, you know, the right wing of the party and Tony Abbott, and I found it very difficult to come to grips with. Current government is a different set of circumstances altogether. I've had a long private meeting with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and I must say that I found him quite understanding of what we're trying to do. If you look carefully at a couple of his more recent speeches, the tone and the possibilities offered have elements which are positive there. There are processes in train at the moment. Look, I wouldn't expect him or any other Prime Minister to bring down their government or split it over this. There are some issues in terms of some of the people on the right of his party. And by the way, I've met with most of them on an individual basis. It's not a simple issue, but we're heading, look, the proposal which we made for a representative voice to the parliament is so simple to put in the constitution, because everything to do with it is being left to the parliament. It's only the framework that's going to be put into the constitution. So, and it's not going to be justiciable. That's the proposal. at any rate, and no right of veto. I couldn't imagine anything that's easier to do. Look, what came across to the Referendum Council from a very detailed, lengthy representative dialogue process carried on was they didn't want all these symbolic changes to the Constitution, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So what are we going to do? We're going to recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in a way that's unacceptable to them? Ridiculous. So this is what they wanted, and I'm absolutely convinced that sooner or later this will happen. I'm absolutely convinced.
From your lips. Let's move on because there's some other really interesting areas that both reading the book and just recently, you've had some really very close friendships with people like Bill Hayden, Paul Keating, Julia Gillard, who are all prominent Labour members. And in this week's Jewish News, you wrote a beautiful, well, so did Jeremy actually, beautiful articles on Yitzhak Rabin. Can you give us a bit of a background on your relationship with Rabin and how that developed?
I met him for the first time in the 80s, early 80s, when he was head of the, I hadn't come across him during his first term as Prime Minister. I met him in the 80s when he was head of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee. And then, of course, later on, he became the Defence Minister. And then the Prime Minister. Look, or the Prime Minister first, I should say. Look, I had invited him. So that's when I met him first. And I used to meet him quite regularly when as I was president of the Zionist Federation on my trips to Israel. And he was always happy to see me, almost invariably, and spent time. And you know, I used to smoke cigarettes at that time. I was a smoker. So I mean, others may have found the extent of the smoke a bit difficult to take because he was a chain smoker. I mean, every time I saw him, there was an ashtray there which was brimming over.
And he also liked whiskey.
Yes, he liked whiskey as well too. I found, look, he was very shy. He really was shy, quite sort of reserved. And one of the, in the Jewish News, one of the stories, the thing that impressed me about him was his humility. It's almost impossible to imagine that today any Prime Minister anywhere, because it would stand by his wife because of some technical issue relating to $20,000 in a foreign bank account, which was illegal, and pull out of a race for being Prime Minister when he didn't have to. It was made quite clear to him that he didn't have to, but he said, "You're saying this about my wife. It was a joint account. She may have been managing it, but I was just as responsible as she was, and I'm not, if you're going to send her to trial, then I'm going to stand together with her, and I'm not going to stand as Prime Minister." Remarkable.
Absolutely.
Remarkable. And, you know, it's, I'd like to see a bit of a return to that nowadays. But look, I'd had on a couple of the social occasions, had the opportunity to spend time with him, and he engendered confidence in a way that few other leaders did. And the fact that he was a Sabra was significant. I think too. He was the first Sabra, you know, Israeli-born Prime Minister of Israel. So look, to me, he was my hero in many respects, and you know, I was with him a couple of weeks, I think, before the assassination, and I hopped on the plane, ended up in Bangkok. I was very tired and I stayed there overnight. I was going back early, very early the next morning. I didn't put on the TV. I just slept through, got to the airport. And then I'm walking through, you can imagine, Bangkok airport, and I'm seeing these TV screens, which I couldn't understand it because it was entire. Was this, anyway, the truth came home to me. And I was the only time I actually came home off an airplane, sick with total dehydration. I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. I was just so
Yeah.
it was an incredible time. You know, those were the days when Israeli prime ministers could actually go down for a walk down the street without being surrounded by 30 bodyguards.
Yes.
Can't do that anymore today. So he was a remarkable leader, and who knows how different the history of Israel would have worked out had he survived. We just don't know. So hopefully lessons have been learned from what happened then. I think they have.
Actually in Jerusalem, actually with your brother, on an ECAJ mission where we spent almost 2 hours with Rabin, January 1995. And he just solidly spoke, just didn't take questions, didn't hesitate. It just spoke for at least an hour and a half on why we needed peace. And now was the time for peace. And we walked out, nobody said a word. As we walked out, it was just, we were all so mesmerized by the presence of Rabin. And to sort of be there 6 months later, maybe a bit more, and he's gone, was devastating. I know that feeling. And it was also a time when there was a lot of, I remember going to Ben Yehuda and coming up with Rosenblum, from the president of Queensland Council for 700 years. And we were walking up and there's all these settlers attacking the police just outside Rabin's office home. And I'd never seen Jew fight Jew. And that was also very devastating, very devastating.
Look, extremism is unacceptable, whether it's from the left or the right or from anywhere else. And unfortunately, you know, extremism, which claims to be sanctioned by the Almighty, is the worst of all kinds. Absolutely. Because it's impossible to have any reasonable dialogue.
I agree, absolutely. I was listening to one of the other interviews that you were giving a few weeks ago, and you mentioned that you actually had meetings with Yasser Arafat and Mubarak, which struck home. How did you organise that, and what did you expect to get from that?
Right. So I didn't meet with Mubarak. I had a meeting that was organised for Mubarak, but then when I got to and I did meet with his foreign minister, Abdel El Magid. I was supposed to have a meeting with Mubarak, but I was told, well, you may have to stay here for 2, 3, 4 days. We can't tell you exactly when. And I thought, you know, enough's enough. So, but as far as Arafat was concerned, look, this was just after the Oslo Accords were signed. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I decided that I wanted to see this man and see for myself what he's all about. So I came to Israel. It was, what was it, late 1994, I think. 94 or 95, I think it was 1994, late 1994. And I had asked the foreign minister in Australia, who was then Gareth Evans from recollection, and I asked him, I'd like you to organise this meeting for me. which he agreed to do, and PLO accepted it. But before I went in, the one thing I didn't do was tell my wife before I went, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened, I can assure you. So
it's a good job she doesn't know.
So, but, and she wasn't very happy with me afterwards. But I did check with Rabin's office, and he was very happy for me to go. So, and not only that, I also checked with, you know, at that time, Ehud Olmert, you know, he obviously had changed his views, but he was one of the Likud princes at the time, and he also told me to go. So on that, here I am, and the Australian ambassador, I'm with him in his bulletproof car. By the way, when I went there, I insisted with Arafat's office there that I'm going there. I'm not just going there as a Jewish leader, I'm going there as a Zionist leader.
Wow.
Right? So absolutely insisted on that. I also put my kippah on, which I generally wear when I'm in Israel at any event, but I put it on because, you know, I wanted to make a demonstration of the fact. And here I am in this car. The Palestinian Authority insisted on putting a guard inside the embassy's car with me. I started a conversation with him and asked him where he came from. He came from Iraq, so I decided it probably wouldn't be productive to continue that conversation. So, and then he made me take my kippah off, not because there's anything wrong with it, but because for security, it's not good. So we must have been traveling about 80 miles an hour or something through there. We were whisking through the seats with sirens blaring, and then I put my kippah back on as we arrived. Then, so we came in there, and it was interesting. We spent almost an hour with Arafat and 2 or 3 of his ministers. By the way, the conversation with him was impossible because you'd ask a question and he would just launch into a monologue which had nothing to do with what you asked. Right. Did have constructive conversations with some of his ministers there. But of course, for me, the piece de resistance is I walk in there and I'm so bloody nervous, excuse the language, I'm so nervous that I spill a glass of water there, and Arafat jumps up, grabs a tea towel and starts cleaning up, you know, the water, the mess over there. Anyway, what can I say? Then the real problem was, but, you know, I asked the questions, didn't quite get answers, we got monologues, but when we left, it was a real problem because I knew that Arafat had a problem of wanting to have photographs taken and putting his arm around the person concerned. And the one thing I was not going to allow to happen was having Arafat putting his arm around me. So anyway, I maneuvered myself with some difficulty.
Would have gone down well.
In a way that avoided that. And the other thing I had to, when you're nervous, you know, you tend to smile. So I had to make sure that I just didn't want to have a smiling photo there. Got the photo, but not without his arm and no smile. So there we are. But it was a fascinating meeting. Sure. As far as the other meeting was concerned, I got myself into a bit of trouble over that. I wanted to meet Mubarak, as you say, so the Egyptians approved the meeting, and that was the only one in time that I'd been to Cairo. I was met by their protocol people and taken to the hotel and told that I'd be meeting with the foreign minister the next day. So I turned to Abdel Magid. He subsequently became head of the Arab League. By the way, we're talking about around 1988. So at that time, Shamir is the prime minister and Perez is the vice prime minister, but the foreign minister at the time, you know, it was a government of national unity. So I went to see both of them before I went, and they both encouraged me to go ahead. And at the time, there was that arbitration about Taba, whether it was going to be given back or kept or everything else. It ended up by going to arbitration. So both Shamir and Perez told me to give assurances that they would abide by whatever the result of the arbitration was. So I went there and I had my meeting with Magid and who, by the way, that had been organised. Foreign Minister Bill Hayden told me to give Mr. Bill Hayden his best wishes, and we spent, I must say, I spent just over 3/4 of an hour with the Foreign Minister, and someone came in after half an hour and gave him a note. And I found out subsequently that what had happened was that the Jordanian ambassador was coming to pay his last respects because he was leaving office, and he'd been kept waiting so I could finish my conversation, which I found, I must say, quite amusing at the time. When I walked out, my mistake was when I walked out of the place, an AAP reporter just said, "What were you doing there?" So, without thinking, I said, "Well, I was passing messages back." I didn't go into details as to what they were. And anyway, Perez was very happy with me when I got back to Israel. Shamir was totally furious because who's he to say that he's taking messages, so on and so forth. Anyway, Ehud Olmert sort of cleared the air and we're all happy thereafter. But no, so that's the background. It was quite fascinating. I mean, the foreign ministry there in Cairo at the time was like a palace. They all sit in little groupings, separated out. It was,
amazing, absolutely
an amazing experience.
Yes. So moving on to the very latest of where we are in the Middle East, and we have the new Middle East, with Israel having relations with the UAE, and that spreading hopefully through the Middle East. How do you see the next 5-10 years within this new concept, and how would this affect Palestinian-Israel relations?
I think the big problem over the next few years is Iran. It's a major problem. It's a significant factor in why Israel has managed to enter into these new relationships with Arab countries. And whoever wins the American election, I'm pretty sure that there are going to be more countries entering into relations with Israel. I think it's very positive. I mean, the fact is that until now, the Palestinians have managed to hold Israel up to ransom. In other words, you're not going to make peace with what they're in effect have been saying. Until you give us what we want, you're not going to make peace with any other Arab country. So what Israel has achieved in all of this is very significant, and you have to give Trump credit for that. Whatever you say about him in relation to other matters, this has been a very important achievement as far as Israel is concerned. So I'm sort of optimistic, again, subject to the question of Iran. We just don't know what's going to happen internally within Iran. It's very difficult to foretell the future, but there's no doubt that the balance is changing, I think, in Israel's favour. And, the Iranians, the leadership want to be around to live another day. They do have some understanding of the consequences of going to war with Israel.
Yeah. And finally, Mark, you've headed some of the prestigious Jewish organisations in Australia, not the ECAJ, but the Zionist ZFA. You've been given an AC. unless Tony Abbott comes back, I don't think you'll get a knighthood. But what's for the future for Mark Leibler? What do you do now?
I don't know. Look, I haven't retired from life.
No, good.
If there is an area that I can do some good and help, I'm always willing to do that. I do get lots of calls from people asking for advice on, particularly in relation to communal sort of issues, but it's not something that I need to think about. I'm still,
you don't strike me as a regular golf player, or
no, I can't stand golf, and that's why I'm still an active partner in my legal practice, the senior partner. I go when you could go into the office. I went in every day, and I'm proposing to go back as soon as
you can.
I'm able to, because I think it's important to keep the mind turning over and working.
Absolutely.
I enjoy coming together, coming to grips with difficult problems. I enjoy helping people, finding solutions. It's I guess it must be in my DNA somewhere, but the idea of spending my time playing golf or watching the
I think I'm the only Jewish dentist that doesn't play golf, so well, I hope we see you maintain this level, because on 2 or 3 fronts, major changes have developed really because of your input. There's a lot more in that book that we could discuss, but probably not for this forum. But I just need to ask whether you're happy to take any questions, or...
Of course, I'm happy to take questions. By the way, what I didn't mention, I still remain as the national chairman of AJAC, and I'm still very much involved, at a leadership level in Karenai Sod and the World Karenai Sod, so World UIA. So I'm continuing these interests, and my tax work continues.
Right. Well, long may that remain. Long may that remain. I can't actually see any particular questions here. Does Alex, maybe if you open up, if anybody wants to raise a question. I tell you what, if you want to raise a question, just pop it in the chat, and I'll read out the questions. And in the meantime, there's one from Helen. Helen, do you want to just open your microphone? Helen? You've got 10 seconds.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Mark. Nice to see you. I was just lying on my couch enjoying listening to you. I'm just wondering, because you're very aware of the World Zionist Congress and the issues that occurred there. And I was part of the Congress as a delegate, and the altercations in relation to the first agreement that was made on the more orthodox side caused a lot of angst. But finally, things came to, there was a reasonable agreement. Are you able to tell us something about who is the new chairman of Keren Hayesod and the new president? Do you know anything about either of those people?
Well, there is not a new chairman of Keren Hayesod. The world chairman of Keren Hayesod is exactly the same person who was elected 2 years ago.
Sam?
Sam Grunberg,
okay,
who's done an absolutely outstanding job, for reasons which relate to agreements entered into between the various factions. There was an attempt to propose other candidates, which were knocked back by Karen Hayes-Sod. And there was an agreement that he would be re-elected for a period of time, 18 months, close on 2 years. And instead, he was elected for a further 6 months. There is an advice and consent procedure to be entered into before a chairman can be elected. And, you know, we stand, I'm talking about Karen Hayes-Sod, we stand firmly behind Sam Grunwu.
Yes. And the president, there was some changeover. That was a woman, and then someone else. What was all that about?
That's not the president. That is
Who is it?
That
CEO.
is the CEO.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, there was this is too lengthy to go into.
Let's not forget this is CCJ, and this.
Well, that's what I said. That's what I said in the chat, that it's not CCJ.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you very much.
There is a question here from Fred Seligman about how does Mark envisage Morrison progressing greater satisfaction for the Aboriginals regarding land rights?
Well, when we're talking about land rights, I think the Prime Minister, everyone seems to understand that if we're going to move forward, then it's got to be not white bureaucrats telling Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders what to do. What is important is that we get the feedback. There's an element of self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders so that they are essential partners in whatever's going to be done in relation to them and their future. We need to hear from them. That, by the way, is why this Uluru Statement of the Heart was so important. We're talking about a voice to Parliament. We're hearing it. We're talking about constructing an Aboriginal advisory board which will be in a position to have direct input into various changes. Look, we have forget about land rights for a moment. Look at the difference in the life expectancy rate. So 10, 11 years, can you imagine that? 10, 11 years is the difference in the life expectancy of an Aboriginal child compared to a non-Aboriginal child. I mean, that's just totally unacceptable.
Absolutely. There's a long, long way to go.
Yes, indeed. But I think we're getting closer, and I think the Prime Minister understands this.
Yeah, oh, well, I hope so. Abe, you've got a question, but I can't find the question. I can see your name 3 or 4 times. Do you want to just ask Mark your question, Abe?
Hello, Mark. Wonderful to see you again. And thank you for all your support to Uncle Bordy and all of the William Cooper legacy stuff, which I understand even more when I hear you explaining your motivations. Mark, with your remarks in relation to never having come across anti-Semitic remarks from Aboriginal people in Australia, could I take it a step further? Would you be encouraging Australian Jews to go to rallies, whether they're called Black Lives Matter or by another name, and really show their solidarity, so long as those rallies aren't held during COVID restrictions? Or do you feel that within Australia, some of that reference to the American issue should apply and Aussie Jews shouldn't attend?
No, I think Aussie Jews should be encouraged to attend the sort of protests that have been, doesn't matter what they're called, that have been organised, you know, for support of, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia. I've got no reservations about saying it doesn't matter really what it's called. We're not supporting it so much an American organisation, we're supporting our Indigenous people. And I think we're obligated to do that. And people should be encouraged to do it.
So if I could just squeeze in a follow-up. So if we had some rather conservative voices in the Melbourne and other Jewish communities who are bigoted about that. Do you have any advice for those of us more in the centre to try to bring them on board?
Well, I'm not sure who exactly who you're talking about there, and if you're talking about the real bigots, nothing on earth that you're going to say is going to bring them on board, and I think we just have to keep away from them. You know, you're going to have. Look, what I have found generally is when I look at, and there are extremes, by the way, within the Jewish community, both on the right and on the left. And in my younger days, I would take them on. But nowadays, what I discovered actually pretty quickly is that if you start taking them on, you actually enhance their importance. You make martyrs out of them. You make people stand up and take notice where under other circumstances they wouldn't. So you'll see, unless, you know, I'm directly attacked, which happens very rarely nowadays, I keep away from these people. I don't comment on them because all it does is to enhance their sense of self-importance, particularly in these days of social media.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
Mark, one question which I meant to ask you, which I didn't, I think I must have glossed over, was really the Jewish background to your social justice. I mean, I've known you and of you for the last 30, 40 years, and there's a different Mark Leibler now to the Mark Leibler I knew 20, 30 years ago. And your involvement with social justice is extraordinary. And a lot of people on this have been asking whether that comes from your family background, your Jewish background, or that combination, or your involvement once you met people like Ron Caston and Pearson and all that lot.
Yeah, I mean, if you take someone like Ron Caston, I mean, he really did a remarkable job when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. In fact, on a number of different social justice issues, but he was completely dedicated to this cause. Yeah. I mean, when you look at what he did in relation to that Mabo case was just monumental, frankly. It was just monumental. It required a great intellect and perseverance. So I think we've got a lot to be grateful for to him. And it's so sad that he was taken from us so early in life. So I'm a great admirer of his. I'm a great admirer of what he achieved. And, you know, you think about had he been around longer, how much more he would have been able to achieve. So, yes, and look, it's a combination of factors, I think. But, you know, you look back at the Holocaust, you look back at 2,000 years of pogroms and persecution and everything under the sun. You hear the Jewish community, we've come to Australia, it's been such a wonderful country. I mean, outside of Israel, I can't imagine a country on earth that is better for, you know, Jews to live in than Australia today.
Absolutely.
You know, it's really, in many respects, this is the golden age of the Jewish people. But, and by the way, I mean, I'm not suggesting it's not going to get worse here, but when I look at what's happening in the United States on the campuses there, it is absolutely frightening. They've become hotbeds of Jewish persecution and anti-Semitism. So we live in this wonderful place and you know, we've all done, you know, pretty well here. And then you look at this fantastic country and you find, you know, people, our original Australians, our first Australians, living in circumstances which are worse than you find in many third world countries. This is a blot on Australia. It's a blot on us. And I think particularly having regard to our history, we've got an obligation to do something about it. And that's the reason why I sort of got involved. It was Ron Caston who first brought this to my consciousness, and then Noel Pearson, and then I met some wonderful Aboriginals. I mean, I was the co-chair of the expert panel appointed by Julia Gillard with Patrick Dodson. What a wonderful man he was. And of course, I knew his brother Mick from Reconciliation Australia. Lots of other wonderful people. Look, I could go on, but I'm not going to.
Right, quite right. Okay. We've got one more question from Albert Isaacs. Just unmute yourself, Albert.
Yep. Look, thank you for a very interesting talk, Mark. Excuse me. Sorry.
I was go and get tested.
I was recently at a University of the Third Age talk on Aboriginal rights, and during question time, I mentioned to the non-Jewish speaker that there were similarities between the Aboriginal relationship to the land and the Jewish relationship to Jerusalem. And the look of absolute surprise on her face, and she said to me, I've never heard that before. That puts the Israeli-Palestinian situation into a completely different context for me. Now, my question is, should we as Australian Jews be promoting that similarity more than we are?
Well, I think yes, and Noel Pearson himself makes reference to it, land-based identity. I mean, although we're citizens and we live in Australia, our spiritual homeland is in Israel, and too many people overlook the fact that, you know, we've got a history in terms of living in Israel, the Jewish people, for over thousands of years. So, but I'm not sure. I mean, look, it is, the Palestinians have rights as well too. The problem with the Palestinians' issues is the Palestinians have made it impossible to sit down and to negotiate over those rights because, well, you know, the Gaza part, the Gaza Hamas are dedicated to Israel's destruction. They're open about it. So how do you negotiate with people that are dedicated to your destruction? And as far as the Palestinian Authority is concerned, when you sort of pay those who are terrorists and run about killing women and children and others, it's very difficult to see how we're going to have a peaceful resolution of the conflict in the near future. I mean, I personally am a deep believer in the two-state sort of approach to this. And I don't believe we ought to be doing things which are going to make that impossible in the future. But, you know, looking at it in the short to medium term, it's very difficult to see how this is going to come about unless there's a change of attitude on the part of the Palestinians. I mean, personally, I believe that probably 3/4 to 80% of the Israelis would opt for a two-state solution and be prepared to make a pretty wide-ranging compromise if they believe that you know, Palestinians were serious in coming to a peaceful resolution. And one of the reasons why the left has been decimated in Israel is because no one believes that this is on the horizon at the moment. If that were to change, it's the Palestinians. It's interesting, isn't it? It's the Palestinians that are really keeping the right in power in Israel.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Albert. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I will call on Alex to say the last few words. I don't think there are. So, Mark, thank you very, very much. That was fascinating hour and a quarter.
My
and
pleasure.
I hand back to Alex.
Indeed, let me follow Philip's sentiment and say that was absolutely fascinating. This book is particularly fascinating to anyone. I don't think that we've had a CCJ event that I recall that's ever talked about the intricacies of the United Israel appeal and also Arafat. So I think this has particularly been interesting and fascinating, as I said, to me and to everyone who's part of this call. It's also remarkable to see the breadth of Mark's community involvement and experience, and I think we saw on the chat, Marian in particular informed us all some of the things that Mark has done and continues to do, as he said. Hopefully, we haven't seen the last of Mark's involvement in many areas of the community, and equally in many areas of the law, which continue to be his focus. So thank you again, Mark, for being so gracious in everything you've said today, for agreeing in the first place to do this, and for those who may not know, Chapter 13, as we said, is particularly about CCJ, but Chapter 17 is actually about Noel Pearson most prominently, but also it starts off with an event that CCJ was very much involved in organising, yes, which was the
and Abe were all there.
That's right. The Noel Pearson oration. The only one that wasn't there was Mark himself, who was but CCJ has been underwriting the William Cooper Legacy Project since the inception, and that's the organisation that ran that event. And so, in many ways, this is, as much as it's a book about Mark Leibler and about power, about law, about the Jewish community, about Arnold Bloch Leibler, we also feel that it's also a book about us as well. So thank you to Michael Gawenda for writing it and for including that. And thank you, of course, to Mark for being the subject of that and bringing all that together. So on that note, let me conclude by thanking you all for attending. Thanking you all for asking questions and being so interactive in this conversation. And the publications that Philip and Mark spoke about that were published in the 90s and sent to schools, we actually have copies of them. If you want them, feel free to write to the CCJ and we can send you them. But our idea, as Philip explained, is also to update them. And hopefully over the next year or so, we'll have that opportunity to update them, because after 25 years, they probably need some updating. And then we'll hopefully be able to distribute them again to the next generation of students. So that's our plan for next year. For anyone who's on our mailing list, you'll see we'll have one more event coming up later in the year on the 6th of December. So you'll hear about that shortly. And in the meantime, I hope you go out and enjoy this lovely sunshine if you're in Melbourne, or have a great the end of your weekend anyway. Thank you again.
Thank
you.
you.
And thank you, Mark, again. Take care.
Pleasure.
Bye.